Talking about training plateaus, this why did I stop progressing is a very common question, and I receive quite a few of these. Like I'm running 3 times per week, but then after 2-3 months of starting, I stopped progressing, or I ran a 30-minute sub 30-minute 5K after 3 months of training, but I'm not improving any further, so my result stays the same. And all of it comes from either of the two effects. It's basically a so-called training plateau where the result has stabilized, and it either comes from not enough stimulus, so our body doesn't have a higher kind of per benchmark to adapt itself to, or there's accumulated fatigue, meaning we're too tired to recover from what we have been doing. And there was this one particular year where I was training very hard, completing all intervals to the maximum and not skipping session. I was feeling tired, but I was pushing through. And then in the middle of the season, I went for one of these VO2 max tests, where they test your zones and test how kind of further you have improved. And basically, none of my values have improved since spring, and ironically since last year as well. So basically, I spent almost half a year while staying where I was, even though I was going harder, and I basically tried as hard as possible. And this is what I frequently hear in coaching sessions. Like, I'm struggling to get faster. I tried everything, more volume, different intervals, heel repeats and everything. And kind of this is something that many struggle with. And as I mentioned, the typical problem is this, that we have our initial performance level, we do a training session, then we recover for some time, but we don't let it jump over our initial performance level, and then we do another session, and then another, and then another, and often those sessions are not, well planned. It's just I go out for a 40-minute run, and then I pushed myself, and then I repeat that the next day or in 2 or 3 days. And kind of my expectation of training in this particular graph, it could be seen that I start here in week 1, we're in spring, and then every week I need to add more training load because I have a race in summer, and as the summer progresses, I need to train harder and harder and harder until the race, and that's when I can recover. In reality, this graph on the left. This is the direct route to getting to a training plateau, being overtrained, being injured, or things like that. Because we always need to give our body some rest. And my problem was this lack of planning. Even though I was following the plan that coach had me, I did it kind of with full gas, without referring to kind of where I am in my training, what are my areas of improvement. And back then, my coach actually didn't use all of these VO2 results from all these VO2 max tests, because it was kind of like just to confirm that I'm healthy. And basically, in this case, this is the reality, how we should approach our fitness. We need to push ourselves until some point of time, and then step down to let the body recover. Then push again, then recover, push again, and recover. And this is where the kind of this supercompensation effect that I mentioned in one of the previous slides starts to work. So we do one session, then we recover from it, we let our body to supercompensate, and then we do another session, and then another and another. So kind of we always build on the level of kind of on an increase in our initial performance level. And this is why all of the programming must start from our current level, not where we want to be or where we used to be or where others are. For example, if we do a program of an all of a sudden we decide that I want to run a, I don't know, 10K in 35 minutes, and then you start and you jump on a program that an Olympic 10K runner is using, and at the same time you're running, let's say, 48 minutes per 10K, then within 2 weeks you would be extremely fatigued or let alone injured. And at the same time, if we train with someone who is much slower than us, this is a less common problem, but it is a problem as well. So if we train with someone who doesn't stimulate us enough, then after a training session, we miss that supercompensation, and at that point of time, it just kind of we go into the detraining mode, just because the impact of the training is not so high. We would need to do essentially a training maybe on the same day. So in order to progress, we actually want to consistently increase volume and intensity based on where we are and what our body can tolerate. And only by doing that, we will be able to go through a training process and actually enjoy it, and kind of not hate running after training for a marathon, but actually sign up for another one, maybe look for a place fun to travel to, where to do a marathon or do an exciting challenge or something like this. So when we plan a season, we need to really approach it strategically. We need a plan in order to be able to train well and get a proper result. So we need to first determine what are our key goals. So besides running, for example, let's take that same person who runs a 48-minute 10K, maybe in the longer term, his goal is to run a 35-minute 10K, but that is a more of a 2-year plan, I would say. That person needs to understand, so, okay, what are my limiting factors? Maybe that person has some extra weight that he or she needs to drop, or maybe they need to develop more aerobic base to get there. So understand what are those goals. And typically, if a person is on the slower end, so for example, kind of roughly between 55 minutes per 10K and above, then for that person, 90% of focus should be on developing as high of an aerobic base as possible, because the more mitochondria we have on the body, the more they're able to process fat for fuel. And actually, for those people who are overweight, that helps to shed that weight, because the more efficient the body is, the more kind of weight it will drop. And however, the problem with mitochondria is that it is built primarily with zone 2 training, or with very high and very fast and very short zone 5 efforts. And zone 2 training, to be effective, requires volume. And that is where many people actually kind of don't get too far with zone 2 training. Because if you are a runner, you cannot run basically more than 1.5 hours every day without injuring yourself, if you don't have that experience, if you haven't built to that. So this is where we need to start combining it with cycling, with some low impact activities, maybe even walking or hiking. But for zone 2 to actually work, we need volume of at least 1 or 1.5 hours almost per day to really grow that base. For those who are struggling with weight, drop that weight, or basically get efficient, so that later on in the season we can reduce the volume and increase the intensity to actually get faster. But I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself. So first we determine what is our kind of thing that we need to achieve. Then we split our year into a meso and micro cycles. So we have a macro cycle, which is a big, typically it's a 1 year, 1 year cycle. Then macro cycles split into mesocycles. Meso is a period of maybe a few months. And then there is microcycle, which is basically a week. Then we select the relevant training methods, and then we create a session and we scale it up and down. That's basically how you plan your season. And that season should always go in a wave-shaped approach, as I mentioned, and that's called periodization. So your training load should consistently increase, but it should be built towards a specific race. However, training load can come from 3 different factors: from training volume, training frequency, and training intensity. So if training load increases here, for example, it doesn't mean that here we're training 20 minutes, I don't know, 3 times per week, and here we're training 10 hours per week. No, actually, there are different periods. And do I have? Yes, I have a table of the periods. So basically, we have these 6 periods where each period is dedicated to a certain adaptation in the body. And the reason we have these periods or mesocycles is for every adaptation our body goes through, be it endurance, speed, power, or even muscle growth, it's, as mentioned, triggered by a specific intensity level, and that requires a certain recipe to be effective. The more or too much or too little of particular ingredients, and then the result would not be as expected. Unfortunately, we cannot train everything with one type of session. So we cannot grow power and endurance at the same time. They require 2 different effects to be effective. So the same session can actually work at the detriment of another. Which is why we have these periods. At every period, we have a different goal. So, for example, let's go slightly into this, as I call it, microcycles. We have adaptation, foundation, build-up, simulation, racing, and then transition period. So in adaptation period, this is where we prepare our muscles and ligaments for the intense training process, and here we need basically consistency, stretches, mobility, and idea is to basically relieve muscle tension. As we get into foundation period, that's where we need to create that base, to create that frame into which we will start developing that Ferrari engine. So it requires a relatively large volume. So as I mentioned, for running, it's better not to do too much running because of the shock and that each step makes on the body, and it's better to combine it with, for example, cycling or skiing and things like that. But anyway, the core idea is that for us to build to improve the cardiovascular system and kind of grow the heart bigger, we need that volume, and that develops the base, strengthens muscles, and on strength side we also need to develop maximum strength. Then as we go into a build-up phase, we stabilize or actually decrease the volume in order to move more into the power phase. That's where we start translating that maximum strength that we took from foundational phase, and we start making it a more training specifics. So to kind of paint you an example, in kayaking, we would do a lot of bench presses and pulls to grow maximum strength during winter, and then as we get into the spring, we start actually simulating the the kayak stroke to make sure we're able to apply force as efficient as possible, so that when we get into the boat, we can actually pedal hard. And that's what we do in build-up phase. In simulation, we essentially simulate the demand of a race. So that's where we would, for a marathon, we would do those longer 25, 30 kilometer runs, simulate the marathon pace just to prepare our body for the demands of a race, both psychologically and physiologically. In a taper, that's when we achieve the best condition by slowing down the training load and actually kind of preparing for the race. And transition kind of mirrors the adaptation process, but the goal is to, again, sort out any imbalances, but more importantly, recover the muscles, recover the nervous system from all of the training load that happened throughout the season. And I wanted to add this slide on training modalities because there is quite a lot of topics about high intensity, low intensity training, that we should only train in high intensity interval training, we should only train in polarized training to avoid, for example, moderate intensity. In reality, it's not so black and white. It actually needs to shift from one training modality to another. As I mentioned, as we start the season, we need to first of all grow our endurance and grow the amount of mitochondria we have, so that later on we can process more training load, and with more of that training load we can actually improve more, because our fitness is directly related to how much training load we can process. And for example, for a marathon runner, they need to start from high volume, low intensity, and that's where we grow that base. Then progress in the build phase. We start adding more of the moderate intensity to develop that aerobic capacity, to develop power and improve the speed. And then as we get closer to the race, actually again decrease the high intensity part and focus really on the threshold part. Whereas for other races, the polarized method actually would help to improve the speed. So it will be dependent on what are the specific goals. But regardless of specific goals, there is a so-called a 10% rule in terms of how you scale up or down your volume. And our bodies are capable of much more than we expect of them, but only if we listen to the signals it gives us. And if we increase the training volume too much too soon, the body will not be able to process it fully, and some form of breakdown might occur. It can be accumulated fatigue, it can be a mental burnout, or even an injury. So if we all of a sudden start running too frequently, and it can happen that after a few weeks or months we start developing a form of, I don't know, some pain, probably at the bottom of the foot, and that's because our ankles were not ready for that impact. Instead, what we want to find is that rate of change that the body is comfortable with, and that would be our kind of state or rate of training absorption. And for that, this 10% rule is a good starting point. And basically, according to that, we should increase our training volume by, on average, no more than 10% every week. And every 3 or sometimes 2 weeks, it's good to step it down. As you get more experience, you can actually find your own ways around it, around that 10% rule, because your body gets more resilient, you know it better. In my case, for example, if I would want to start kayaking again, then I would probably need a week of just easy easy kayaking for 1 hour every other day, but then I would be able to go on a training camp where I would ramp up that volume to 2 or 3 hours per day for, let's say, 2 weeks, and that would get me quite quickly to the fitness I intend to get. But from there, I would again need to listen to my body and probably slow it down a little more. And also, if you're skipping training sessions, it's a good rule to stick to when kind of resuming the training. So if you skipped, for example, a week of training, then what you can do is the next day the day when you return, you basically reduce the volume of your training that you used to do before that week by 30%, and then again start applying those 10%. You start building gradually, and that 10% might not sound too quick, but at the same time it means that in 2 months roughly you double your training volume. So for example, if you're doing 5 hours of training per week, and that is, let's say, I don't know, 30 or 40 kilometers of running, then if you apply 10% rule, then within 2 months you will be running probably 60 or 65 kilometers per week, which is a decent mileage, but you would approach that gradually, not all of a sudden. So there is a higher chance that you would be able to actually maintain those 60 kilometers per week. And I've mentioned here duration, frequency, and intensity, meaning that we should always look at duration, frequency, and intensity when we apply that rule. So for example, if our total duration is 2 hours per week, then by applying a 10% rule, that means the next week we can increase that by 12 minutes in order to be able to do it consistently week over week over week. And at some point of time when we will build that volume, we can kind of switch into intensity and increasing the intensity. Frequency is the same thing, but kind of it impacts it indirectly, meaning we did 3 times, for example, we do 3 times, 3 sessions, 30-minute each per week, and we want to do a 4th session per week. So originally we had 90 minutes of training per week, and if we add a 4th session, that would be 120, considering that it would be a 30-minute session. And that is a big change for the body. That's 25% increase. There's a high chance that after a few weeks, it would be quite tough to continue. So instead, what we need to do, we add the 4th session, but we drop the intensity of all of the other sessions by some 7 or so minutes duration, which would total to those 99 minutes, which would be a 10% increase. And then start increasing 1 session per week until 30 or 40 minutes, and kind of gradually pick up the overall volume. With intensity, slightly different. Intensity, we would want to calculate the total amount of time we spend at high intensity over the week and increase that by 10%, and then really pay attention to how we are